Our distinguished speaker tonight is one of the biggest leaders in the communications industry, with over 30 years of public relations, public affairs, advertising, and consulting experience in New York and Washington, D.C. He served on the boards of many companies, nonprofit, and governmental organizations, including CC Investments in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he resides. And he recently completed a term as presidential appointee to the National Council of the Endowment of the Arts, and also to the President's Commission on the U.S. Postal Service. Don Cogman first met the subject of this book, Mitch Daniels, Governor Daniels, as Chief of Staff to Senator Dewey Bartlett of Oklahoma. And over the years, he's got to know the great competence of Governor Daniels, who served as a CEO of a think tank, a multi-million-dollar company, director of the Office of Management and Budget, twice elected and successful governor of Indiana, and now the president of Purdue University. And his book is really interesting. He asks, why doesn't such a man run for the nation's highest office? I mean, Donald Trump is running, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. Why not a man of Mitch's competence? And you'll find this out in this very informative and cleverly titled book, Run, Mitch, Run, which George Will calls a fascinating look at the interplay of the personal and political, a story of one of modern history's might have been. So, ladies and gentlemen, Don Cogman.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great privilege, really, to be at this presidential library. I've had an opportunity, as we've talked about this book over the last 9 or 10 months, to be at several presidential libraries, and it's always a great honor and a privilege. This one in particular, for a couple of reasons. And I want to thank Jonathan and Ian for their great hospitality. But this one is particularly special for me because Richard Nixon was the first president that I ever personally met. I went to Washington in 1972 as a very young chief of staff to a newly elected U.S. senator from Oklahoma. And I was new to Washington and new to the Senate, and about 6 months into our time there, in those days, and particularly during the Nixon administration, they used to have state dinners, but then following state dinners, they would have entertainment in a different room, and they would invite other people just to come to the White House for the entertainment. And somehow I got my name on that list as the chief of staff to a new senator, and it was a black tie event. And so I got to go to the White House, which was a pretty awesome thing for a young 24-year-old who had been in Washington for 6 months. It was a state dinner for Willy Brandt. I remember that, the chancellor of West Germany at the time. Germany was still divided. And the dinner was in the state dining room. Entertainment was in the East Room, this room on the other side of this wall. And I remember the entertainment was the Carpenters. Everybody remember the Carpenters? And it was a pretty interesting time. The other reason I'm so delighted to be here, which is in a very special relationship, is that Ron Walker is somebody I've known for about 40 years. Ron Walker is chairman of the foundation here. When my senator came to Washington, he was on the Interior Committee. In those days, there wasn't an Energy Committee, it was the Interior Committee. And one of the things the Interior Committee had oversight for was the National Park Service. And as some of you may know, Ron Walker was director of the National Park Service during the Nixon administration. And so I got to meet him, got to know him, and then over the years, Ron and I did business around the world because Korn Ferry was a search firm that we used for many, many countries and many, many years. And he and I worked together on many projects. The thing I really most remember about Ron Walker, though, as some of you may know, he started really as an advance man. And you know, when you do advance for a presidential campaign and for a president, you really have to be good. You have to be highly organized. You have to have a very strong work ethic. You have to be charming, yet forceful, dealing with the Secret Service and volunteers. And Ron Walker sort of wrote the book on advance. So it's really a pleasure to be here for both those reasons, and to be able to talk about this book, which I think, given what's going on today, still has a lot of relevance. I would really like to spend most of the time answering your questions or talking about anything you'd like to talk about in relation to the book, but Jonathan asked that I try to give you sort of an overview of the book, how it was written, why it was written, and so I'll spend a little bit of time doing that. I've done quite a few interviews on this book over the last year, and the first question is normally always the same, and that is, why did you write it and why now? Because this is about the 2008 presidential election. And as I tell people, it didn't really start out as a book. It started out as, in my mind, sort of a recording of history. And as we proceeded through the process, and as I talked to Mitch about it, he thought that it might have some interest to other people. I first wrote it, and he didn't know anything about it. I was sort of the keeper of our notes and all the different aspects of what we were doing. And so I had a file box full of notes about this almost 20-month period, almost 2 years that we worked on this. And somebody called me one day and said that they had had a call from Mark Halperin, who was the author of two of the really premier books on the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections, and they were doing a book on the presidential election. They wanted to do a chapter on Mitch because he was very much involved in it for a while. And he asked me whether or not I had heard from him, and I said, no, I didn't really know Mark Halperin, and I doubt that I would talk to him. But I said, you know, I'd always thought about writing a book about our adventure, but I didn't think Mitch would want me to. Anybody that has worked at the White House is very suspect about things like that. And he said, well, you should. You know, it's history. And so that sort of got me thinking about it, and I went to my files, and it took me a couple of weeks to organize them. You know, in this day and time when you have the internet, you can literally sort of organize notes, not only chronologically for a month, but almost down to the hour. And so I first organized the book by issues, then I organized it chronologically, and then I literally organized it down to the day and sometimes down to the hour. And as I proceeded to do that, I decided sort of how I was going to outline the book. And so I basically sat down and I wrote it in about 30 days. And then I thought to myself, well, now, how am I going to tell Mitch that I've done this? And so I've always thought that was sort of fate, because I literally, after I thought about it a little bit, got a call from him. This is when he was already at Purdue as president. And he said he was going to be in Arizona, and he was going to be somewhere near my house, and could we have a drink before he was there to give some sort of speech. And so I said, sure. And so I went over and we sat down with him, and we exchanged pleasantries. And then I said, by the way, I need to tell you about something I've just done. And I said, I've written a book, and it's sort of about our adventure. And I proceeded to sort of tell him about it. And his first reaction was, you know, Don, you don't have enough to do. And I said, well, I'm supposed to be retired, and I need to keep my brain working. And I said, look, this is entirely up to you. I had the manuscript. I gave it to him, and I said, you can read it, and you can throw it away. You can read it, and maybe we ought to make 10 copies to share with our friends. Or if you think other people might be interested, we could actually think about publishing it. I said, it's completely and entirely up to you. So he took it, and he read it, and he called me in about a month, and he said, you know, I just think that this might be interesting to other people, because there's so many people literally every 4 years that go through this process of trying to decide whether or not they want to run for president of the United States. And he said, I think we ought to publish it. So people ask me why now and why the book, and there are really three main reasons why I wrote the book. One is it's sort of a nuts and bolts description of what it takes to run for president. So if you're a political junkie and you like that sort of thing, then this will be a book I think that will be interesting, because it really talks a lot about what it takes to go through that process. The second reason I wrote it was to just talk about Mitch and why we thought it was his time, why we thought he was different, why we thought he was unique at that particular point in time. I tell people, if you don't know Mitch Daniels, I recommend you read it. You start at the back with the appendix, because there are two speeches in the appendix, which I'll talk briefly about. One is the speech he gave to CPAC about a year into this, and another copy of a speech he gave to the Gridiron Club. Because if you read both those speeches, I think you will see immediately why we thought that this was a unique individual. And so the second reason was because I wanted to talk about Mitch and why we thought he was the right person at the right time. And the third reason, and really I think to me what makes it such an interesting story, is the emotional toll it takes on the family. Because this really is a life-changing decision. As I tell people, you know, when you run for president, you don't run with the idea that you're going to do anything but win. And so it's not just the campaign, but it's the campaign, and it's 4 years, and it's 8 years in the White House. It's a life-changing decision. And in many ways, it's perhaps even more life-changing for the family. And so the book is about the nuts and bolts. It's about Mitch, and it really is about the very difficult process that we went through with the family in making the final decision. So as I said, the book is sort of organized chronologically. So let me just sort of give you a preview year by year as sort of how the book is outlined, and then again, I'd really like to be able to just take your questions. It really all started on September 26, 2009 with an article in the Wall Street Journal by Kim Strassel. You know, the Saturday Wall Street Journal, for those of you who read it, there's always an interview with someone, and that particular day, there was an interview with Governor Mitch Daniels, and she started off the interview by saying, you know, Governor, you're one of the few popular Republicans in the country today, and there are a lot of people who think you ought to run for president. He completely poo-pooed that idea, and the rest of the article was really on what he was doing as governor. But I read that article, and I waited a couple of days, and I picked up the phone, and I called him, and I said, you know, it was a great article. I said, you know, what do you think about that idea? And he completely shut it down, saying that's not something I've ever thought about. I'm going to serve out my second term as governor, and then that's it, and I'm going to go do something else. And he really had no interest in even talking about it. So a couple of weeks later, I'd gotten some calls from mutual friends, because all of us had sort of grown up together in Washington. I was an AA to a senator. He was the chief of staff to Senator Richard Lugar. So we'd known each other a long time. And I called him back and I said, you know, I've gotten calls from a lot of people, a lot of our mutual friends, and they think you really ought to think about this. And he again said, you know, this is just not something I'm ever going to do. And I said, well, you know, would you be interested in at least getting a couple of people together to talk about it? And finally he said, well, I'm always anxious to see old friends, and so as long as everyone knows I'm never going to do this, sure, let's have a meeting. The one way I knew we could get him to go was I called a good friend, Tom Bell, who was one of the members of our group. Tom Bell was a member of Augusta National Golf Club. I said, I know how we can get Mitch to come and at least talk to us about this. And so we arranged to have a trip to Augusta to play golf, and that did it. So when we were thinking about putting it together, it was Tom Bell and myself and Mitch, and I had thought about one other individual. And Mitch called and said, you know, if you want to talk about this, he said, no disrespect to you and Bell, but perhaps we ought to get someone here who really knows what they're talking about in terms of running for president. And so we asked our old friend Charlie Black, who had been through every presidential campaign for the last 30 years. So the original group that went to have this discussion was Tom Bell, myself, Mitch Daniels, and Charlie Black. Tom Bell was an advertising executive, former 8A to Senator Bill Brock, former head of the Hudson Institute. He recruited Mitch to be his successor, was then in the real estate business in Atlanta. very experienced in both national politics and the business world. And so our goal in Augusta was to get him to say, you know, I will at least let you explore this. And at the end of 2 days, we did get the go-ahead to at least explore it. So the next sort of threshold event was we had a meeting in January of 2010, and we had it in my house in Arizona. And we decided that we were going to invite 7 people. These were all people who had known Mitch for many years. He had trust in them. They were there for various and sundry reasons, but it was Tom Bell and Charlie Black, and I outline them in the book. Al Hubbard, who was from Indiana, a close friend of Mitch. He had the most recent White House experience. He was the National Economic Advisor to George W. Bush. Bob Perkins, who had worked with Mitch in the Senate for Lugar and for Brock, who was a great marketing genius. He had held the top marketing positions at a number of major companies. Mark Lubbers, who was a close personal family friend in Indiana, somebody who had been involved with Mitch and Dick Lugar. Rick Powell, who was a youngster, he's the youngster of the group. He was probably 15 years younger than the rest of us. He sort of brought the new social media strategic element to the table. Rick had worked for me for about 10 years. And finally, Eric Holcomb, who was the only person that none of us knew, other than the Indiana people. Eric was basically Mitch's political person in the governor's office. So those are the 7 people that gathered in my living room in Arizona in January of 2010 to talk about this. And as I've told people before, as we sat down and we sort of looked around the room, it was just sort of a surreal experience. That here there were 7 people. We'd all known each other for 30 years. We'd been involved in lots of different things. And we were actually getting ready to have a discussion about running one of us for President of the United States. It was a little strange. And we had 2 days of where we literally talked about everything. Finances, policy matters, how you would organize, what the issues would be, communication challenges, all the legal issues, family concerns. But we started the meeting by Mitch saying, look, if I would consent to do this completely ridiculous idea that all of you have, I would want to do it in a very special way. I would want to run to govern, not just to win. And so much of what he said is sort of interesting as you think about what's going on today and in today's political environment. His whole approach was, I want to have an adult conversation with the American people. I want to tell them the truth about where we are as a country. I want to tell them the truth about the fact that we have a fiscal debt that will bankrupt our children and our grandchildren. And I want to run not just to win, but to govern, which means I want to tell them exactly what I do, so that if people vote for me, then they'll help me do what we say we're going to do. He had what he called the survival agenda, 3 or 4 issues that to him meant the survival of the country. And he talked about that, and he talked about an adult conversation with the American people. And so much of what he said in that first 30 minutes, where he literally, it was sort of a monologue of how he would do it and what he believed. And I think all of us at the end of that 30 minutes were reinforced on why we thought that this was his time. It just set the stage for the entire meeting and for the future 19 months. So we left that meeting and everyone was sort of, we understood that he was still very reluctant. We understood that there was probably more than a 50-50 chance that he wouldn't do it. But we felt again that it was worth exploring. So Al Hubbard was sort of our policy person, and Rick Powell was going to sort of work on the social digital media. Perkins was thinking about some of the marketing aspects. Tom and I were thinking about the fundraising, and we sort of divided up the responsibilities. One of the ideas that came out of that first meeting was the idea of holding residence dinners, because he did have a day job. He was governor of the state of Indiana. And so he couldn't really go jetting around the country. doing a lot of things that you need to do if you're seriously thinking about running for president. So someone came up with the idea, I believe it was Bob Perkins, which was not an original idea, others have done it, of inviting people to the governor's residence in Indianapolis, small groups, to both talk about issues, to give him ideas on policy, to let him pick their brain on different aspects of policy, but also to get them to encourage him, if in fact they believe that he should consider this. And the residence dinners proved to be one of the really more successful things we did. We had probably 15 of them. We'd have an energy group. We had a group come from Wall Street. We had a group of people who had loved to raise money at the presidential level. We had people come and talk about health care. We had people come and talk about security, national security. And it was really a great learning thing for Mitch. But for us, it was sort of testing the waters to see whether or not people, significant people, would be interested in this. And about 9 months into it, Mitch was always very concerned about keeping this effort quiet. I think part of it was because of the family. They really weren't completely aware of all that was going on yet. And so he was very concerned about keeping it quiet. So Politico, the newsletter, talked to someone, got a hold of the fact that we were doing these, and published this article about residence dinners. And he was really not very pleased with that, as I relate in the book. But what it did was open up a whole new slew of people, because when people heard that there were residence dinners, they started calling. They said, well, we'd like to come. We'd like to express an opinion. We'd like to tell him what we think. And it really just ballooned from there on. And the residence dinners probably were as key as anything to getting a cross-section of people, some very significant people from around the country, to encourage him and to tell him that this was really something he ought to think about. So as we went through 2010, the media really played an important part in this, because the media, as it has a tendency to do, can really create momentum. They can create positive momentum, they can create negative momentum. But as we went back and looked at all the clips from those days in 2010, the media really picked up on this, that here was a governor who had taken $1 billion debt and erased it and was now looking at $1 billion surplus, who had come up with a lot of really unique solutions, real solutions to real problems, who had a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, and particularly was an expert on, at the time, the major issue of the day was fiscal discipline. How to get our house in order fiscally and start doing something about our debt as a country. And so the media really played a large role in those days in building the momentum that this might be a really unique candidate. And in many ways, it was described as the un-Obama. And what they meant by that was there was a lot of style to Barack Obama, particularly in the early term, as he was thinking about running for re-election. And Mitch was more a person of substance as opposed to style. And so the contrast, they thought, would make a most interesting race. And so they're always looking for angles where they can make something out of it. And that was what they were thinking with Mitch Daniels. This might be a really interesting race. As we went through that year, the decision timetable as we went along was always a paramount concern. That we, at some point you have to make a decision. You have to say, yes, we're going, or no, we're not. In the book, I talk about 5 crises. And I just picked 5. I probably could have picked more. But when you talk about crises, it's sort of an interesting way to look at that point in time in history, because how a candidate deals with a crisis is a really important indication of how he or she might deal with it as president. So I picked sort of 5 crises that went through, and I talk a little bit about it in the book. And I think 2 of the more interesting ones was one had to do with the fact that our biggest problem with Mitch Daniels, really throughout 2010, was he continued to say, you know, I'm really not going to do this. Which was okay if he was just saying it to us in a room, but we were inviting, literally by this time, hundreds of people to Indianapolis. They were all paying their own way. They were all taking time and spending money to come and talk to him. And every time he would be in the newspaper saying, you know, I'm really not going to do this. One of his favorite things was, you know, I look in the mirror and I just don't see a president. Our response to that was quit looking in the mirror. But again and again, we'd have this conversation. We said, Mitch, look, you don't have to say you're running. You don't even have to say that you've been convinced, but just don't do anything to deny the option. That was sort of the mantra that we finally got him to grasp. Do nothing to deny the option. But that took most of 2010, and that really was probably one of our major crises throughout the entire time, was his inability or unwillingness to actually be more positive about the fact that he really might do this. Again, to be fair about it, a lot of it was because he had never really had this conversation yet with Sherry, his wife, with his 4 daughters. And so when they would read something in the paper, and somebody calling about this great candidate, Mitch Daniels, then it would cause a few problems at home. And so that was part of the problem in getting him to say what we really needed him to say. The other crisis that I think probably caused us the most consternation was his idea of what he called the social truce. And for any of you who remember back in those days, as a Republican, social issues are important to a lot of Republicans. And to some Republicans, they're the most important thing. One of the first things out of Mitch Daniels' mouth as we sat in our living room in that first 30 minutes was, you know, if I do this, he said, I'm going to call a truce. I'm going to call a truce on the social issues. It's not that I don't think they're important. It's not that I probably don't agree with most of our fellow Republicans on most of them, but in his mind, they weren't survival issues. Survival issues was the debt, national security, energy independence. And so I'm going to call a social truce, and we're just going to put the social issues over here, and we're going to solve all these other problems first, and then we're going to tackle them. Well, in a Republican primary, that's a pretty volatile subject. And I say in the book, I think I actually don't mention who said it. I did originally, and then I took his name out. But one very well-known Republican commentator, who you would all recognize his name, sent Al Humbert an email one day saying, I don't know what idiot came up with the idea of a social truce, but it was really stupid. And we wanted to write back to him and say, well, the idiot was the candidate himself. But the whole idea of a social truce was a crisis because we had to deal with so many of the sort of normal Republican constituencies. It wasn't that any of us disagreed with it, because we didn't, but we could have handled it much better, because you need to sort of lay groundwork for something that revolutionary, particularly when you're dealing with a Republican primary. There were 3 others that you can read about when and if you, and I hope you do read the book. But I think in describing the crises as we went through this process is just an interesting way to look at how people deal with crises, how the staff dealt with it, how he personally dealt with it. So we went through 2010. I remember this was the election of 2012. Most people, when they announced for president, would do it early in the year before the election year. So we were nearing the end of 2010. We were getting ready to enter 2011. Most people who were thinking about running for president were getting ready to announce for president in 2011. And so finally we said, you know, Mitch, we got to get together and we need to really make a decision. And so in December of 2010, we had a big meeting in Indianapolis. we'd gone through all these residence dinners. We had developed an incredible team of people who were keeping their powder dry in terms of raising money. We had a lot of significant people who were asking him to do this. And so we got to the meeting, and we started every meeting we ever had with him by saying, okay, Mitch, so where's your head today? So where are you on this scale? Sometimes it would be, well, I'm about 30%, and maybe I'm about 40, and well, I'm maybe 45. So we get to this meeting in December. We feel like we've got to make some sort of decision, even if we don't announce it yet. And we said, so where are you? And he said, well, you know, I'm about 80%. I'm about 80%. I think maybe we could do this. So frankly, all of us were shocked because I don't think many of us expected him to ever get to 80%. So we had a great meeting, and we had a lot of responsibilities. We had a lot of things to do. We sort of divided them up. Everybody had their marching orders. So we were getting ready to end the meeting, and as I sort of outlined in pretty great detail in the book, as we were ending the meeting, Mitch said, you know, I need you to come down and have a conversation with me in the library. We were in the residence. And so everybody was getting ready to leave and go to the airport, and I was actually staying that night because I was scheduled to have dinner with he and Sherry. And he pulled me in the library and he said, look, I didn't want to share this with everyone, but because everyone's so enthusiastic, and I know people really think, you know, we can do this now. He said, but I think maybe the family is really a big problem. And it really was sort of deflating to me. And he said, you know, I think that you ought to have a conversation with Sherry. Well, I've known Sherry as long as I've known Mitch. And in fact, I tell people, you know, when he first ran for governor, he called me and said he was getting ready to run for governor, which was a shock to me. I've known him for a long time. And the thing about Mitch Daniels is he's really one of the smartest people I've ever known. And he has a very unique combination because, you know, there are smart people who are policy people, really love it and understand it. And then you have great political people who have great political instincts and who love the political game. You rarely find one person who's really good at both, and he was good at both. But what we didn't know about him was, you know, could he be a candidate? And none of us really ever saw him as a candidate. That's a whole different animal. Are you willing to do things a candidate has? Can you connect with a common person? And when he ran for governor, he just shocked everyone because he was a terrific candidate. I mean, he had the ability to connect with a common person. He would stay in people's homes. He never stayed in a hotel during the whole campaign. He'd stay in different people's homes he didn't even know. He had an RV that he went to all these, he'd get on his Harley Davidson and he'd ride all over Indiana. He really did have an ability to connect with people. So anyway, when he was getting ready to run for governor, he said, your job is to call Sherry, this is when he was running for governor, and convince her that this is something that we ought to do. That's your one assignment. I said, well, thank you very much. So I did. I called her, and I had this conversation. And I said, look, you know, I know this is probably not something you want to do, but, you know, let him go be governor, and you're going to find things that you're really interested in, that you care about passionately, and that as a first lady of a state, that you'll be able to really do some things. And anyway, she finally agreed, and she found that to be true. She was a great first lady of Indiana for 2 terms. Got very involved with a lot of children's issues. And so he said, you know, you need to talk to Sherry. So we were supposed to have dinner that night. And I said, well, you know, I think it's better if I talk to her by myself without you. And so I arranged to go meet her before dinner. And she came over to the residence, and we sat down, and I said, look, Sherry, I said, I know you don't want to have this conversation because she'd already told me that. I said, but I just want to tell you a story. I want to tell you how this happened. It didn't start with Mitch. In fact, he's been reluctant for a year. And I just told her the story about how it started, about all these people wanted him to do it, about how we finally, after all this time, really felt like this was his time. It was his issue, it was his time, he had the experience, and he could really maybe do this. And I said, you know, but the family is a great concern of his. So I talked probably for 45 minutes as literally a monologue with her just sitting there. And finally she looked up and said to me, you know, I never wanted to even run for governor. I agreed to it. I never wanted to spend the last 8 years of my life as the first lady of anything. And she said, the family simply doesn't want to live the rest of their life this way. I don't want to have to worry about security. I don't want to have to worry about my grandkids. I don't want to have to worry about my children. I don't want to not be able to walk down the street in sweatpants and go to Starbucks. And she literally just said, this is not something that we're ever going to agree to do. So we had about a 2-hour conversation, and at the end of it, we were already late to dinner with Mitch, and she got up and she gave me a hug, and she says, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but this is a life-changing decision, and we're simply not willing to do it. So we went to dinner that night. We didn't talk about it at all. I had to leave early the next morning to go back to Phoenix, and Mitch had something to do, and I just told him, I said, you know, I'll tell you about the conversation, but I'll have to call you. And so it was probably about noon the next day, and I called him, and I basically told him about the conversation. And, you know, he was quiet for a while, and he said, well, you know, I think let's just keep this under wraps for a while. I said, well, you know, there's 7 other people who are waiting for me to call them, who have spent the last 8 months working on this, and we sort of owe them an explanation. He said, well, just give them the high points. And so I did, and I called everybody, and I said, you know, this is sort of what her attitude is. And I said, but Mitch is not, he's still not quite ready to make the final decision, and certainly not make the decision public. That's how 2010 ended, and we got into 2011, and in my mind, because I knew that he would never do it without their agreement, at least agreement to be neutral. In my mind, we were finished, but this was sort of like the dog that wouldn't die. So the first thing that happened is he was invited to give this speech at CPAC. CPAC is the Conservative Political Action Committee. It's the biggest group of conservatives gather every year in Washington. They have a huge meeting. They invite everybody that's ever thinking about running for president. Mitch had never appeared before him, but he agreed to come in January of 2011 to give a speech. And he gave what was called the Reagan Address, which is the main speech of the event. The speech was, as people later said, probably one of the finest speeches ever given at CPAC. George Will called it the first adult speech I've heard in the last 5 years to a bunch of political people, where he basically told them the truth and told them, here's what I believe, here's how I would face these issues. It was a complete grand slam. And of course, it just started all over again. People would write letters and they'd call you and say, he's got to do this, he's got to do this. The second thing that happened shortly thereafter was the gridiron speech. That's why both these speeches are in the appendix. The gridiron, for those of you who don't know it, the gridiron is this spectacle in Washington. They do it every year. It's the White House Correspondents. It's black tie. They invite a Democrat and a Republican to give speeches, and they're supposed to be funny. That's the whole thing. They're supposed to be funny. And so when they're not funny, the press completely crucifies them. And so most people are scared to death to do a gridiron speech. And when he was invited, you know, he called us, as he often did, and he said, you know, what do you think? Should I do this? I don't know. And of course, we wanted him to do it because we knew him to be a very, really witty person. He had a great dry wit. And so he agreed to do it. And he gave, and the speech, again, is in the book because it was extremely funny. He wrote almost all of it, as he wrote everything. And they gave him a standing ovation at the end of it, which I'm told was almost never happened at a gridiron dinner. That, again, started the groundswell. There were so many articles. Of course, the press was all there, and they write about it. And they write about, you know, this may be real. This would be a really interesting presidential race. The other thing that happened in 2011, the concern that Mitch had, he had two concerns other than the family. And one was finishing his term as governor. He'd just been reelected. He had a big legislative session coming in 2011. He had one more reform he wanted to do that he had promised the people of Indiana. It had to do with education. And so he said, you know, I can't make a decision until the legislative session ends, which was April, because we need to accomplish what I promised the people of Indiana we'd do. And so the legislative session happened. He passed the big reform, and so now it was the end of April. Remember, we had this meeting in December. It was the end of April, and still people were clamoring for him to run. And you know, you now have a legislative session. You have a huge educational reform that could be replicated across the country. Will be a great way to launch a campaign. And finally, we said, Mitch, you know, people were coming to us and say, if he's not going to run, I got to go sign up with Romney, or I got to go sign up because I want to be on the inside. And finally, he said, okay, we'll make a decision in May. And on May 21st, 2011, he arranged to have a call with this group of 7. And it's really funny as I look back on it, and I talk a lot about it in the book. Everybody in our group thought he was going to say yes. And really, so did the press. The Indiana press, the national press, everyone really thought he was going to say yes. I honestly felt that he was going to say no, because I'm the one that sat through that 2-hour conversation with Sherry, and I knew his mind in terms of their attitude. And on the call, he basically told everyone, he got right to it. He said, you know I got to 80%, and I appreciate all of you giving so much, but he said, I just can't do it. And he said, I love my country, but I love my family more. And we immediately sent out something to all our people, and of course the press was, I think, shocked and surprised, and there were all these accolades that came in on all these different columnists who talked about the fact that the Republicans had lost their best chance. Well, as we moved into 2012, certainly it's over. But of course, in January of 2012, Mitch was picked to give the State of the Union response. I don't know if you recall that, but the Senate and House leaders on the Republican side always pick someone to give the State of the Union response to the president. And they want somebody that's not running for president. And so they picked Mitch. Well, once again, he gave a terrific speech. And all the columnists and all the media start talking about him again. And we start getting all these letters again. I mean, heartbreaking letters from the little old ladies in Kansas, and this, just saying you've got to change your mind. And then they started talking, of course, about the vice president. Well, you know, at least maybe he could be vice president. Well, about that time, the Purdue University chairman of the Board of Trustees calls him and says, you know, the Purdue president is getting ready to retire. She's not retiring for a year, but we're getting ready to start the search. We won't even search if you'll tell us right now that you'd be willing to be president of Purdue, because his term was ending in 2012. But if you do that, you have to say immediately that you'll make no further political comments. You won't be involved in any way in the political campaign of 2012 as a surrogate, as a speaker. And he called me, and we talked about it. We had talked about it before because I knew that he had had an interest. And he just said, you know, this is something I think I need to do. And finally, that really did end it. And in the book, there is what we call the afterword, which Mitch wrote. And it's his sort of point of view on the entire exercise and on how he felt about the decision, what he felt would have been the outcome, of which there's some great debate about. But I also encourage you to read that because that's his sort of summary of how this all went. But I'll close by reading a couple of lines on an article that was published in January of 2013, right after the presidential election. And it's by Michael Gerson. Michael Gerson is a terrific writer. He was one of George W. Bush's speechwriters. He's now a syndicated columnist for the Miami Herald and others. And he wrote this really emotional column about the transition and about the fact that there was now going to be a second term for the Obama administration. And he concluded the article by saying this: returning quietly to private life after public service is honorable and admirable. But this doesn't change one fact. The best Democratic politician in America is about to take his oath as President of the United States. The best Republican politician will soon be President of Purdue. And I think that's how a lot of us felt. You know, when you write a book, everybody tries to get you to get famous people to say nice things. And I was very fortunate because I had a sort of a really interesting mix of both Democrats and Republicans and political commentators who said some things about the book. All of them because they were great fans of Mitch. And Jonathan mentioned it when he introduced me, but I think the George Will comment that this is a story of one of modern history's might-have-beens is really also a great summary of what this story is about. You know, I spent about 20 years in Washington, and people go to Washington for a variety of reasons. Changing the world is usually one of them, and some succeed, some don't. But I think that public service can take many forms. Public service, in my opinion, is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for the person and for the family. But it can also be a contribution of great significance. Someone once said that life is not about success, it's about significance. My friend Mitch Daniels has chosen another avenue for his contribution, but it's an important one. He's very involved now in the reform of higher education. It's something that can have lasting impact on many students, many families, and I continue to be very proud of him and his contributions. I had dinner with him a few months ago at Purdue, and as I was leaving, I told him that I had always wanted him to be a president. I just hoped that it would be president of something else. But I continue to be proud of him, and I know that he is making a difference. So I hope you'll read the book. I hope you'll understand that this is something that so many people go through when they try to make this decision, both now and probably in future years. And I hope it's something that you enjoy. So let me stop there and answer questions.
Thank you, Don. Don has agreed to answer your questions. I just first want to say that he'll be happy to meet any of you, all of you, and sign your book after the questions. I'd first like to ask, if Donald Trump becomes the inevitable Republican nominee, short of the delegates he needs to get the nomination, is it in the Republican Party's best interest to unite behind him? And if they don't, could Mitch Daniels participate in a brokered convention?
Gosh, I didn't think I'd get a question about Donald Trump. Well, one of the stipulations that Mitch had to make when he went to Purdue was, I mean, literally, he's not to be involved politically. And he's kept to that, much to many people's consternation. And, you know, I asked him when I first wrote this, in my first conversation with him, I said, you know, now I wrote this book with the assumption that you were through with elective politics. And I said, because, you know, if that's not true, you need to tell me. Because for one thing, I would write it differently. Because, you know, I talk about all the mistakes we made, and as I told him, I talked about all the mistakes we made, all the stupid things you did, how stubborn you are, etc. And he told me no. He said, you know, my politics is about timing in so many ways, and so he really is through. And I don't think he'll be taking an active part, barring something completely unforeseen. And, you know, I don't know the answer to your question about Donald Trump. I've been involved in politics most of my life. I went over to the business side 25 years ago, but I've always been active in it. I've always been involved in it. and I've never seen anything like this.
We have
And
a
I don't know how to answer that question.
We have a question in the front row.
I've been reading a book on the years of Lyndon Johnson where the author has spent over 30 years writing about the president. And you had mentioned earlier that you spent 30 days to write your book. Could you describe a little bit about the process that you took for writing the book? And like, did you mean it to just be 30 days or just anything, I guess, in regards to
Yeah,
that?
I've read those books, and they're historical books, you know. Mine's a story. You know, when I write, but for one thing, it was so complicated because it needed to be in a chronological order. So if I would write something and then leave it for 2 or 3 days, I'd get completely lost. And so the only way I knew how to write it, I had to write it every day. So I literally, from 7 a.m., once I had it organized, once I had all the papers organized and all of the emails chronologically, and once I had an outline of what I wanted the book to say in terms of issues and personalities, the only way I could do it was just write it every day. So I would write from 7 a.m. till 2 p.m., so about 6 or 7 hours straight, and then my brain would freeze over and I'd have to quit. But I literally did that 6 days a week for 4 straight weeks and then finished it. Now, you know, there's lots of editing and rewriting, but the only way I knew how to do it, and the only way I could keep it straight in my mind and try to deal with all the moving parts was to just do it and until I finished. But again, you know, it's not it's more a story than the wonderful books that Robert Caro, I think his name was, that wrote about Lyndon Johnson.
We have a question in the front row.
Let me ask this question with all due respect, and I really do look forward to reading your book. You write about, from what I'm hearing here, about a man who's honest, has integrity, wants to do the right thing, and has, I guess, an identity some way in Indiana politics. Do you think a man could really have won? Do you believe that that man could really have won, and could his way transcend it in a way to get through 60 votes in Congress and pass laws that would have done something good for this country versus having every single special interest in there to just pick apart everything to get their way and come out with just more debt?
Well, I think that was embodied in his attitude about, you know, I'm going to run to govern, not to win, not just to win. And so if you're going to run to govern, you have to lay out exactly what you're going to do. And if people are for it, they're for it. If they're against it, they're against it. But hopefully there would be a majority that would be for it, which would then help you be advocates for the positions that you've taken. He had a great, the reason that I think Mitch Daniels had such momentum and had so many people that were willing to wait on him to make that decision was because he had proven he could do it. He'd proven he took a state that was $1 billion in debt, that had had 20 years of Democrat rule, who had to work across the aisle, and who accomplished great things in the state of Indiana. He had run OMB for 2 years through the 9/11 crisis. He had been in the White House with Ronald Reagan. He'd been in the Senate. He had run a major pharmaceutical company, North American operations for a major pharmaceutical company, a global company. His breadth of experience, both business, think tank, political, government, was pretty unique. But the main thing about him was that he was so scary smart and had the political instincts and the ability to bring people along with him. So the question really for me was, and maybe this is part of your question, is can you tell the American people the truth? Can you tell them that you have to do something about Social Security and Medicare and the things that ultimately will bankrupt this country without making some alterations? Can you tell them the truth? Can you be honest about the problems and the solutions and still win? And I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, and it would have been interesting to find out. Yes, sir.
In 1975, Dewey Bartlett visited Somalia, and when he came back, he made a report on the extent of Soviet involvement in Somalia, and especially Soviet naval facilities. And did you accompany Bartlett on that trip?
I did not. I let him go to Somalia by himself. You know, I was the chief of staff, and we divided it up into various aspects of the office, and our chief policy person, David Russell, now a federal judge, went with him on that trip. But you're right, he did. He was very interested in that part of the world.
We have a question in the second row.
I think mine's kind of a follow-up to his question in a way. In my mind, you're describing John Kasich, and he's my candidate, and he's not going to get elected, and it's killing me because he seems to be the one who's the adult who is being a little bit soft on some of the social things, all of the things that you're saying, and he can't get anything. And I don't know whether, like you say, the people in this country can take the truth, but it also seems to me that the media is extremely influential in this race, more so than I've ever noticed before, because he can't even get a mention because he's not, you know, up there. What do you think? Tell me there's a miracle.
Well, the fat lady hasn't sung yet.
Yeah.
You know, John Kasich, it's interesting. When Mitch was governor in his final term in Indiana, John Kasich was elected. Scott Walker was elected in Wisconsin. Jeb Bush was a governor. And particularly Kasich and Scott Walker spent a lot of time with Mitch when they first were elected as they planned what they were going to do. And a lot of what they have been able to accomplish were patterned after some of the things that he did. He's a big fan of both those people. He's a big fan of people who have been governors because, you know, when you're a governor, you have to actually do something. I mean, you have to...
Anybody would think a first-term senator should have the audacity to even run for president.
Well, without commenting on that, I would say that as a governor, you have to come up with solutions to problems. And he was a big fan of John Kasich, and I think if there is a parallel in the race now, it would have been Jeb and John Kasich, because I think both of them sort of faced problems that he faced and came up with solutions to problems. And, you know, where that ends up, I'm not sure. We still have Ohio to go, and you know, you never know. But I think you're right. I think that's probably the closest. Mm-hmm.
Question in the back.
Does the chairman of the Republican Party have any influence whatsoever over the candidates? Because they're shooting, the candidates are shooting themselves in the feet because we are giving it to the Democrats the way we behave.
Well, I think the answer to that question is no. I think the chairman of the RNC, who, this is well past my time, I don't know him. I think people hold him in high regard. He has a very difficult job. And we have 17 candidates. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Now, I say that's ridiculous. I, of course, speak as a Republican. I was with a Republican senator. But, you know, that's a pretty good bench. Look at the bench on the other side. There is no bench. No, seriously. So I know 17 candidates is a problem, and it continues to be a problem. The good side of that is we have a pretty good bench for future years. But, you know, this is an unusual year. I've never seen anything like it. Ian.
Republicans often get in, there's a disconnect between fighting against government itself, saying we need less, we need less, we need less, and then running for government and talking about what they're going to do. What is it that government should focus on? And your description was with Mitch was the survival issues. Do you think that that is a good platform to go forward with whoever our candidate is, or whoever the Republican candidate is?
You know, Mitch talked about that. I believe it's in the CPAC speech. He always said it's not that all government is bad. You need government. You need government to do certain things. And his record in Indiana, as you go back, in fact, we talk a little bit about that in the book. He doesn't believe that the government knows more than the individual. He doesn't believe in overregulation. He doesn't believe in government intrusion in individual lives. But he believes there's a role for government. And in the state of Indiana, he was very concerned about mental health issues. He was very concerned about education. And there were places where he thought it was very important that government be involved and be engaged. And that was just his attitude, I think, about as he thought about the survival agenda. There are certain things that government needs to do. There are many things they don't need to do. And I think that's the difference in our party, and it's just a different approach. I mean, I think that's why the press, the media, thought it would have been such an interesting contrast if Mitch had been the candidate. Excuse me. Because it's just a very different approach than the other side, and it would have been a great debate to have.
Another question in the second row.
I guess this is following up on her question, but in light of this race and arguably the last two races, do you feel as if presidential nominees need a little bit of a Hollywood factor to get media attention? And do you think maybe that's the way that the future is going to look?
Well, as one person has described this current situation, is we're really just looking at a reality TV show, which is really not good, in my opinion, for running for president. You know, I think the one thing that people ask me what I would like people to take away from this book, and other than the things we've talked about, I think the one other major thing that I would have loved people to have taken away from this book was in hopes that a presidential race, we'd have some return to civility. Mitch very much was of this mind. He had a very strong attitude about negative advertising, about negative campaigning. And again, can you win a race in that way? I don't know. But that's the way he would have run it. And John Kasich probably comes closest to that of anybody. But the return of civility, because the lack of civility keeps a lot of good people from running. The lack of civility certainly played a role in the family's reluctance. And so the idea of trying to bring a little bit more civility, you know, I was in the communications world for most of my career. And so the internet is a wonderful thing. But the internet and social media, particularly in the political sphere, can be a really ugly thing, because people can say anything about anyone at any time with no accountability whatsoever. And, you know, somehow I would hope that, particularly at the presidential level, we would somehow get back to some civility. Now, I said that 6 months ago when I was asked that question, and now we've never been in a political situation where we've had less civility. And my guess is that that's probably going to get worse between now and November. So I just think that's something that we all need to work on.
We have time for one more question in the back row.
Thank you. In light of the questions just been asked, and part of what I may have expected you to talk about and you didn't, is there too much money involved in the political campaigning, and is that causing some of the problems we're seeing today?
You know, I don't really jump on that bandwagon, honestly. I think as long as there's disclosure, so super PAC money where you don't have to disclose, I think is a problem. But as long as you have to disclose, when I think you should have to disclose everything, then, you know, every time we fool around with the political finance system, it just screws it up worse. I mean, I was involved in the 1974 Federal Election Commission, establishment of it and all the rules surrounding it. Was very involved in it. That was all post-Watergate financial reforms, if you'll remember. And so it set up the system of PACs and set up limits. And, you know, is the political finance system any better today? No, it's worse. So anytime we try to regulate and try to overburden the rules in terms of finance, I think we just usually mess it up. My mantra is full disclosure for every contribution that's made, and then people can make up their mind. If they don't think somebody ought to be able to give $25 million, then, you know, don't vote for them once you know who gave it and for what reason. So I realize it's a thorny subject and a difficult subject. I've just never seen us improve it by fooling with it. And you know, there is this thing called the Constitution, which does allow certain freedoms, even though they may be messy.
Thank you, Don. Please give Don Cogman a round of
Thank you all
applause.
very much.
Token of our appreciation, we'd like to give him a memoir, leather-bound memoirs of Richard Nixon.
Oh, thank you.
And these are coincidentally also available in our museum store to buy. Thank you very much and have a good night.